think in linear all the time. So as much as this might have some chronological order, it's not necessarily in the right order, because I do have a great memory for other things, but dates and exactness are always a little foggy in my mind. If you ask me where a shop is around the world, or an object in my vast collection, or a photograph from 10 years ago is, I'll know exactly where it is. But anything else, I'm a little vague. So I thought I would start with a little my bio. I do have a few books, and instead of writing a bio, I write an I am series. So I gathered some information from my past books of all those things. So you maybe have a clearer understanding, if you don't know my work, what I'm into. So I am all things interiors. I am a creator of spaces. I am a treasure seeker, beachcomber, and bowerbird. I am a designer of hardware and home goods. I talk in pairs and write with ampersands. I am a namer of paints. I am a globetrotter and explorer, or was. I am a keeper of lists. I am a stylist. I am an author and photographer. I am a historian. I am a shopkeeper of the Society Inc. I am part pirate and part gypsy. I then thought, just to give you a bit of background, I often think of nature and nurture and your upbringing. And earlier on in my life, when I left school, I remember thinking that neither of my parents' jobs could help me get a job. I was desperately wrong. And I will let you know what they did and how they nurtured me. It was better written in my book Imaginarian, so I didn't think I'd try and rewrite it. I just thought I'd take it from here. Sorry, I need to find it. I grew up in a house surrounded by nature and beauty. Middle Harbour and all its wonders were a stone's throw away. Our garden was a magical place of colour and design. Our house was filled with textiles of art and books and treasures from faraway lands. Even our everyday plates were souvenirs from my mother's travels. My mother was a monumental force in my life. She not only encouraged every single craft class or workshop I dreamt up of doing, but also showed me how to look at the world in detail, looking at sound, depth, height, proportion, composition, and colour. She opened my eyes and my heart to the romance of travel. Mum was a textile collector, a teacher, and a globetrotter who revelled in technique, travel, history, people, and traditional crafts, and how they passed down through generations. My father was a residential master builder. His deep appreciation of bricks sparked my curiosity about materials and finishes. My dad's favourite finish is satin nickel, not my favourite finish. He taught me how to manipulate a space, how to see it without walls, and then how to move those walls. Together we would walk the streets of Sydney and New York, Dad pointing out the differences in the styles of brickwork that revealed their time in history and their origin according to shape, colour, texture, as well as how the master bricklayers had so artfully stacked them: English, Flemish, running, Dutch, and the dental work. He taught me the language of building sites, which I love to this day. The smell of sand and wet cement is such a vivid scent from my childhood, triggering my many memories. So that's where I've come from, and this is where I start to become more of an adult. I was a fairly average student at school. I think the curriculum didn't really suit me or the way of learning, but I did manage to slide into an arts degree at Sydney University, and this is where I really excelled. I was a fairly shy child at school, but at university doing history and fine arts, I learnt not only about those two amazing subjects, but also some life lessons along the way. I had incredible tutors who encouraged me to research and delve into all the things I was passionate about, and then have the confidence to stand up in a group, a small group, in my tutorials and speak out loud. At school, that was probably my worst nightmare. Today, I do this kind of thing quite often. So how far you can come from being quite shy. I have lots of students come through my work and work with us as interns and also employees. And so often you hear about that shyness, but do never fear, it can be overcome. I never thought of myself as a particularly ambitious person, and I'm not. I'm just incredibly curious and adventurous. So once I was at university, as it was coming to the final year, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. But luckily I had a friend who was a good planner, and her name is Edwina McCann. She's now the editor of Vogue and has been for a decade, amongst many other titles that she looks after at News. She was the lowly fashion assistant at the time at Vogue, and she thought it would be a good idea if I came into the Vogue office and helped them out. Well, I quickly realised that fashion was not for me. But this is when they were at Greenwich, and they shared a floor with Vogue Living and Vogue Entertaining and Travel. At that time, particularly Vogue Entertaining and Travel was being watched by the world. The styling was outstanding. It was headed up by Sharon Storia-Lynham, who was an incredible designer. She had an incredible eye, and she ran a tight ship. I loitered long enough over on that side of the office to be thrown a few bones every now and again. At the same time, I became part of an incredible group of young, curious, creative, kind of the new guard of what was happening in stills and photography, well, in stills and fashion at the time. It was a studio on Crown Street in Sydney. It's, I think now, a Maserati showroom, I believe. And it was an old automobile station of some descript at the time. We had a permanent studio on the right-hand side, which I shared with, well, I think there was a photographer that owned it, Quentin Bacon, but we promptly just used his space with William Mepham, Donna Hay, myself, and a bevy of others. And we had such an incredible upbringing and start to our early careers at the time. At this time, I'm all of 21, 22, and I start my own company. Although this might sound like a young age, it isn't as unusual as it sounds, as I come from a lineage of entrepreneurs and small business owners. So it didn't seem too out of the ordinary for me. I also was surrounded by these contemporaries and freelancers who also were starting their companies, and although just a couple of years older, they were able to give me all the advice I needed at the time. One of those big pieces of advice is get yourself an accountant and a bookkeeper. That was a really big one for me. I had at this time what I like to think of mentors, although they're unofficial and some of them I've never met. Many of them I have now, but at the time I hadn't. Ilsa Crawford, she's just such a design icon and legend, was heading up Elle Decoration UK at the time from 1990 when I left school. She was the editor there, and the way she approached her story, her visual storytelling, and got her contributors to do it was just so new. It just changed how we were viewing editorial stories and any of the visual storytelling, and I was a big part of that movement. At that time, or around that time, Marie Claire Lifestyle launched in Australia. I don't know if it exists anywhere else, but it launched in Australia under the direction of Karen McCartney, who's still a very dear friend of mine. She was the most incredible editor. I was a contributing editor at the time. I was all of 23 or 24. Donna Hay was the food editor. And Donna and I, being very dear friends, decided that we would team up and do food and interiors together. Although this seems common nowadays, back then it certainly wasn't. we were doing something that hadn't been seen before in the editorial market, and we were being watched. We did incredible shoots. We were hiring new photographers that were fashion photographers. We wanted people that handheld their cameras. They weren't on tripods. This is the time of film. There was no digital. It was the time of Polaroids, but we started hiring the likes of Hugh Stewart and other fashion photographers, Derek Henderson, amongst others, who wouldn't even give us a Polaroid, but would just snap all day, and we would hope that we had got the shots. But we did. Thank God. And I still have those tear sheets today, and they have stood the test of time. With that, and the world watching, I worked with an older photographer who got asked to submit, from America, he was Australian, but he got asked to submit 5 portfolios from stylists in Sydney. Because the Australian style was so heavily coveted in the pictured storytelling world, I was lucky enough to submit my portfolio amongst it. He was slightly against it. He thought I was too young to be travelling the world. But again, I was quite adventurous. And when they had seen all the portfolios, they picked mine. And that was the start of a new chapter for me of living overseas. I went on my first job to the States with Jeff Lung. We met in Savannah, and the directions were, here's the address in Savannah, see you there Thursday at 12 o'clock. Something as that's the call sheet, from Australia, Savannah thing. So book a ticket, hire a car, drive through, you fly into Charleston, then you have to drive to Savannah. I think I did it without even batting an eyelid. And I drove and did that first job. Whilst I was there, I thought it would be rude after the shoot, which was hugely successful, not to pop down to Miami and check out the new Delano that had opened by Philippe Starck. It was fabulous. And it was unprecedented what they were doing with hotels, and him being the father of coining the term boutique hotels. I had been watching him for some time, and my love of hotels really started after visiting that one, of how exciting they could be. And the journey of now designing hotels had started there. After that job, within weeks, I was contacted again by the client that I worked with and flew back to the States. And my commute from Australia to America started intensely. For a year, I just flew back and forth. This is when you have the energy to do that kind of travel. I am lucky I don't suffer from jet lag or have only a couple of times in my life, but I flew back and forth on such a regular basis. It was a monthly basis of flying back and forth, and I would come back to my jobs here and I'd be off again. And after one of those jobs, I stayed. I had no intention of living anywhere else. Sydney is my home, Sydney is my love. I never craved to live in the States, but if there is any opportunity when you're young to do that, I highly advise it. I think it's an incredible experience to have. So after living in the Gramercy Park Hotel, this was pre the Julian Schnabel renovation of it. It was quite a lovely old rambling hotel back in the day. And you could do long-term rentals on a section of the hotel. So I used to stay there for a month or two at the time. But it also planted a seed for how I would build my business, The Society Inc., many years later. Because when you're on the park there, Gramercy Park, it's almost like a London kind of set out where you have a central park, and if you live on the park, you get a key into the park. But if you don't live near the park, on the park, you don't get the key, unfortunately. So Gramercy Park is surrounded by beautiful old brownstones that circumnavigate or surround it. And when you peer in, not all of them are residential. I don't think many of them are residential, but again, my facts I wouldn't take that as factual at all. But there's many old societies there. So there's theatre societies, science societies, all sorts of different societies, old-fashioned, old-school societies. And I'd walk around of an evening and you can see it's where they've got a basement level, a traditional brownstone, so a basement level. Then you have the first floor, which has got much higher ceilings, which would be the public floors, like the parlour, like an old Georgian, a Georgian building, and the parlour, and then it would have the rooms upstairs. But the parlour is where you could see it from the street and you could look into these big windows of like-minded people conjuring up all sorts of shenanigans and great ideas, and I would look of an evening and watch them have conversations, and that's how the society sparked many, many years later. As I'm going on my walk in Tasmania, I was thinking about the highlights of my decade in the vibrant city that it is, and it was nice to reminisce. There are some foggy times. I worked very hard. I also liked to dance the night away. So there is some vagueness to many parts of it. But when I went through the highlights of it, I decided I also had to, well, I'll go through them, but I also want to say what a day in the life of living in New York's like, because when I was going through the highlights, it sounded like I was, what's the main girl in Sex and the City? I felt like I was being Karen Fisher. You know, it was being filmed at the same time, actually, that I lived in New York. And at that time in New York, this is the time of big budgets and big editorial stories. I was traveling the world for Travel and Leisure and Condé Nast Traveler, and you would fly to San Sebastian for 10 days to capture some images. I would write some captions to it. I always worked with the same photographers. I would often be in the photographs, and then you'd have so much budget that you'd be like, oh, I can't understand, we'll just get an interpreter for the whole time, or well, let's just get that boat for 3 days, or whatever you could desire to get a picture. This was the time of, it was just incredible. I remember starting a magazine in San Francisco called Taste, and I was the creative director of the magazine, and we would just go to Paris and stay at the Georges V. I remember I rolled over 7 times in the bed and I was like, wow, this is big. It was an amazing experience over there, and the importance of those Australian magazines and what we were doing here is what had captured the Americans' imagination. I would walk into meetings at the beginning, and they would have my tear sheets out from the magazine, so you knew you'd got the job, which was lovely. It is a hard city too. It's incredibly demanding, but I did have the opportunity to work with some of the greats, from Martha Stewart to Bergdorf Goodman, Donna Karan, Calvin Klein. I worked for every magazine, I think, from Food and Wine, House and Garden, Architectural Digest, Martha Stewart Living, Town and Country, Departures. I basically shot every single day. Sometimes I could be doing up to 5, even 6 shoots working on the Saturday. It was physically exhausting and demanding, but at the same time exhilarating, rewarding, and creative. But you do end up being on this very beautifully designed, the mouse wheel. It looks gorgeous in there, but you're on it. I even had the opportunity to work on a very small team. There was 4 of us that started Vogue Living America with Anna Wintour, which was a real highlight as well, amongst many, many others. I also remember, when you live in New York, you hear of these urban myths of people having these incredible apartments and lofts, and they hardly pay anything for them. And, how did they get that? Well, I had that. I had a 2,000 square foot loft in Chinatown with what, when I look back now, is very affordable rent. And I was in that one for 5 years and another place for 5 years. And it was absolutely incredible place to live. So the life in New York suited me well, but every day I missed home. But just so it doesn't sound like Sex in the City, New York was demanding in every way. The logistics of the city are impossible to even understand when we live in a very easy city to get around. You don't have a car. You live in a 4-flight walk up, and even if you have say an elevator driver, he starts at 9 and finishes at 5, which were never my hours. So you're still walking up the 4 flights of stairs. It is physically challenging on your body. The days of like a prop stylist is the first there and the last to leave. And my day started well before the shoot started. I would be at the flower market at 5:30 in the morning, 6 o'clock. I'd be at my storage space. I'd be packing a whole truck. I might even be driving a truck, getting to a location. You might have to then pack up that location of all their furniture, input all the furniture you're bringing in, shoot it all, maybe wallpaper it with blue tack, take it all back down, pack it down before 5 o'clock, get it back into the truck, go back to storage, and your day finishes at 7 p.m. at night. So there was a point where I decided after 16 years of doing that every week, day in, day out, that it might be time to start thinking about a bit more of a passive income. But it is true, if you can make it in New York, you really can make it anywhere. I came back to Australia, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but I did learn the business skills, keeping to a deadline, making sure every job you do is excellent and you've put 200% into it and that you've covered all bases, all those things that meticulous work ethic is fine-tuned when you live in a city like that, and you can come or work anywhere after that and really apply, again, those life lessons. So moving back home, I had an idea that I didn't want to style as much, and the retail experience in New York was really changing a lot. You were getting not just your regular shops, you were getting these immersive experiences. Donna Karan did it first with a shop uptown where it had a music lounge, it had a juice bar. Again, this might sound quite common now, but back in the early 2000s, it wasn't common at all. And I was watching this retail chain change. There were shops like Ernest Sohn in the West Village that you walked in on beautiful salvaged timber that had moss growing in between the timber, and everything was antique. And then you go up the back and there was a gallery, and then there was a coffee bar on the right. And that retail was starting to really excite me. So I started looking for a shop also. I thought, after all this styling and meeting the most amazing makers, craftspeople, dyers, sign writers, upholsterers, that I would be able to create a shop that showcased and celebrated all these other people that I uncovered and would be highlighting in magazines, but I could highlight them in my own shop. So I started looking for a shop in New York and found the most incredible space it was on Green Street, just below Grand, and actually it was between Grand and Prince. And after a long 10-month negotiation, I was ready to sign, but I thought coming home was a good idea because another 10 year, it's a 5-year lease with a 5-year option, felt like another long decade in New York. And I came home around August, where we get those 2 weeks of when spring is coming. And it was shiny and it was sparkly, and I was with my family and I was swimming, and I happened to meet Justin Hemis. And he was opening Ivy, and he was telling me about the exciting things that were happening in Sydney as well, amongst other things, and I decided to move home. And it was such a catalyst to what happened next. So after 10 years there with all these incredible things happening, just on the spot, I'm like, I'm moving home. And I knew that the decision was the right decision. So I started the process of packing up my 4 storage spaces, my 2,000 square foot loft, and my business. And within 2 months or 3 months, I had moved home in the December. I decided to take off a few months and for the first time in my working career have a think about where I wanted to go next. And I had never done that before. And it was one of the most powerful decisions that I've ever made, because in that time, my mother took decorative arts tours all around the world and she died in India very suddenly. And I had had the opportunity to spend a good 6 weeks with her before she died. And her spirit, she was like a superpower, and her spirit landed in me and changed me forever. I suddenly had an energy that I didn't know that I had existed in me before, and how I looked at the world shifted, and I became an ideas person rather than someone following a brief, which I was really good at, and following someone else's brief. I just started coming up with my own briefs and my own ideas, and I had given myself these months to not be working. And what came out of it is I bought a beautiful shop called the Society Inc. I then went to India with anthropology. I was their muse for many, many years when I moved back to Australia, and I travelled the world with their design team. And on one of those trips, we were in India, and the general manager said to me, "Why don't you design some hardware? I have had a long love of old things and old objects." And I was like, "Sure, I'll do that." And I designed a range of 10 pieces of hardware for them, which was the birth of my hardware range. They were their top sellers for over a couple of years. The agreement I had with them was they would introduce me to their manufacturers and they would have an exclusive on that hardware for that time. And that's how I learnt and became friends with the manufacturers I have with India today. That opportunity to travel with them as well also sparked into several books. The first one I did, Etc., I wrote just after my mum had died, and my girlfriend Donna Hay had said to me, "Why don't you write a book?" And I was like, okay. So I popped down to Murdoch and I said I'd like to write a book. I had an incredible editor at the time who also said, okay. I wanted to have creative control over it, so I photographed and wrote the whole thing before I signed the contract, which was fairly unheard of. All first contracts are pretty shitty anyway, so I thought I'd do it my way. And Etc. became an award-winning book that went into, I think, 10 languages and was a worldwide success, which was incredibly fabulous at the time. And then I went on to do other books that were more travel related, and directly because I was traveling so often, and anthropology were a huge part of that. So Justin Hemmes comes back into the picture. He's open to Ivy and he starts asking me if I will design permanent spaces. I didn't want to do much styling when I got home, and my brother, who's a photographer, also suggested that I shouldn't do any styling anymore because I've had stopped listening to the art directors, and he thought that was awkward. So I did give up styling to a degree, and I moved into permanent spaces. I teamed up with Justin whilst I had my shop also. I was travelling extensively, and we opened many spaces together. Some of them you may recognise, including Mr. Wong, Palmer & Co., El Loco, The Fish Shop, amongst many others. It was an incredible opportunity to learn from someone who's been in hospitality for such a long time, and also to use all my skills as a set designer and building enormous sets to then put them into permanent spaces. It is a different application, but it's still all your ground knowledge and your foundations can be used. Yes, you need to know about table heights to chair heights and banquet measurements and lighting and all sorts of other things, but there was this beautiful transition from not permanent spaces to permanent spaces, and learning from someone like Justin and Bettina Hemmes was just like a speed course in hospitality that I treasure today. At this same time, This is a funny one. I think it's funny. With the opening of my shop, I was doing some styling, and I was doing something for Inside Out, and I put these boxes together that represented different rooms that I was going to make, and one of them had a monarch butterfly in it, a bead, and like a napkin or something. And I said, well, that's one room. And the next room had a blue feather in it, a ribbon, and a leaf. And I said, that's another room. And I did this full presentation. Karen McCartney was the editor then, so she's laughing in the background, knowing exactly what I'm talking about, where her staff have got no idea what I'm talking about. There wasn't a piece of furniture inside. There wasn't a sample. There was some beads and some leaves and some feathers. And I'm like, they're my 3 rooms. And they're like, oh, okay. And Karen's like, she's fine. You've got 7 pages. I'll see you in 2 weeks. And I came back with these rooms, and I had showed these boxes to Rowena up at Murabond, and that was the beginning of the paint range that I did. I started with Murabond 12 years ago, which now has 110 colours in it for your homes. And we're releasing another palette shortly, actually. We haven't done one in a long time. Also at this time, I got asked to do my first reality television show on Channel 9. Again, like working in the Vogue office, this was not for me. It was the first and last of my reality television shows. One of the books I did around this time too was The Stylist Guide to New York. Again, this one was so beautifully received. It's a travel book with a difference. It's still in print. I mean, I don't think the information's right anymore, but Murdoch keep printing it. The shops have all moved. It's over a decade old. But the interesting thing about this book is I had a photographer lined up to shoot it for me, James Merrill, who I mentioned as one of the first photographers I worked with in the States. And he got a better job. And he told me to go and pick up my own camera and take my own photos. And other than me being really pissed off with him, I did pick up a camera. And as much as we'd had a dark room under our house when we were growing up, I hadn't picked up a camera in my styling career because we had such fabulous photographers. But this was a real turning point for me, and I photographed that whole book. And then went on to photograph lots of parts of my other books, which was incredible. And then we walk into starting to do collaborations. So I do collaborations with a lot of companies, but the first collaboration I did was with McTavish surfboards. McTavish surfboards. I decided I wanted to surf, and McTavish surfboards make the most beautiful custom-made longboards up in Byron Bay. So I decided I'm one of those people that needs all the gear, even when I have no idea, and in all sorts of, from sailing to snowboarding to whatever you name it, I'll have an outfit for it. And so I went in and I started to design my own surfboard, and then I mentioned to them, well, maybe I could do a range for you. I mean, I'm not even a surfer, and I'm suggesting to a 1960s established surfboard company that I designed surfboards for them. Anyway, they said yes, and which was really, well, actually I just took it in my stride, and I did that, and the person who said yes is my now husband. So not only did I get surfboards, I also got a husband out of it who runs my company. So he does all the back end and puts all the systems in place and makes everything happen behind the scenes. Also at this time, I fell pregnant, and on the same week I found out I was pregnant, I also signed my deal with the ABC to do a program committing to 3 years on Restoration Australia. So as you can see, I do go into things a little unplanned. I do have the adventurous spirit, and I do have the belief that everything will end up okay and be okay at the end of the day. Thank God it was. I was pregnant obviously throughout that whole series and had a small baby that I travelled around Australia with. I decided that I couldn't fit that filming into my weekday because I was too busy, so I shot every second weekend for 2 years to make that program. My work ethic, as you can see, is quite strong, and I find it hard to distinguish between my private life and my work life because I get so much enjoyment out of both of those. So this is Merchants and Traders, which is our working title for my hardware range, with my not yet husband coming into the scene. He has a retail background and he did incredible things to set up our company. And this is where that dream of having a passive income the many years before comes into play. As a designer, many of you will know that you design so much custom stuff for each job, but it's a one-off. And just doing something like the hardware range is I design it once and often we sell thousands and thousands of that one product. So I do love that I've been able to use all my design knowledge to then work into a product range as well. We have over 250, maybe 400 SKUs of products now. That is just such a treat to have and sort of have as my girlfriend says, my side hustle. I have made lots of mistakes in my life. As I said, I edit my history, and I'm sure we all do. And often the highlights stand out more than the failures or the things that didn't work. Failures is such an awful term. I have done many projects that have not worked. My sister said to me not that long ago, it's just incredible that all your ideas come to fruition. And I just looked at her like, are you crazy? I'm like, I have 50 ideas for one to work. I come up with so much stuff, it gets edited down to the top 10. That top 10 gets more time dedicated to it, more funds dedicated to it, and then one exists. One example of one of those small mistakes in a large format is I decided a few years ago, maybe 6 years ago now, again, my timeline's not great, I decided to go into partnership with renting 2 lofts in New York that were massive, that they would rent out on Airbnb, and I also thought that I could design them and install with a 1-year-old in a 2-week period in January during blizzards. It was not a successful partnership or idea. The one cool thing out of it is because I had worked with anthropology for such a long time, the GM, Andrew, invited me to go and hire the biggest truck that I could find, drive to Philadelphia and fill it from their samples warehouse with whatever I wanted. That was pretty cool. After buying my small shop in Paddington, which some of you might know, we moved to a much larger premises in St. Peter's, which isn't going to be in the same format for too much longer. So if you haven't been and you want to see it, we will be moving in a few months' time. But we have grown. I've never stopped contributing to magazines. I love the printed matter. But we have other things on the horizon. So I just thought before we go into Q&A, what's next for me? We're launching an immersive retail experience in form of what I think of as a digital magazine that we will have online that will be editorial stories, photographic storytelling. It will have how-to videos. It will have workshops, amongst other things. Nothing that these guys produce, but a little small, fun little side project we're doing. I'm designing my own home at the moment. My DA comes through in 4 weeks' time, which I'm very excited about, because all those ideas that get somehow edited out of other people's projects can come into fruition into my own house. And then I still am on all my interior design jobs that I've now the creative director of 2 big projects that are 5-year projects, plus my store. I actually went back and thought about the things I know and what I've learnt. So I thought I'd read you this little list that have worked for me. So these might be things that you could take away or be inspired by or not. Follow your passion, I always have. Stay curious. The importance of saying no. I've always been really good at saying no to a lot of jobs. It leaves room for the right jobs to come in. And know that there's enough work for everyone. Don't squirrel, be generous, celebrate other people, pass on jobs to the ones that you think are more appropriate for it. And that takes me to being generous with your information. I do celebrate my community, whether it's the makers or other designers, and always pass on their info. There's many ways to achieve your design intent, but stay flexible. There's not just one way, there's many. My mum always said, keep the spring in your step. I think she meant stay fit and healthy and strong, and eat your greens. Thank you. I think we're doing questions. If anyone would like to know or ask me anything, I think we've got the opportunity to do that. I'm 50 next year. I can't believe I'm 50 next year. Yeah, I suppose when you start your career, what you really love at 20 and expand on it, I feel very fortunate for finding it at such a young age. Yeah, and you work hard, right? Yeah, but yeah, it's always felt very natural to me, very natural.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much. I lived and worked in New York for 12 years, and I know the societies around Gramercy Park.
Yeah.
I used to get invited to the Municipal Arts Society.
Which one?
Municipal Arts Society.
Nice, yeah.
And I think it's brilliant that you found a way to capture that aura, because it is so charming in those parlor rooms.
Isn't it lovely?
So that's fantastic. So as program director, I wanted to ask you this question.
Sure.
What could you give an example of something that an intern would work on with you?
Oh, so we're into our second block of interns at the moment. Okay, well, 2 weeks in the Society Inc. can be in many different formats. The first thing I tell them is, here's all the things I think you're going to do, and that might change. So it can be from doing an install within my shop, so more of a visual merchandising aspect. It can be coming on site visits, so to some of our interior design jobs, meeting a client and following through design if it's a small compact one within a 2-week period. We do designing of hardware. So what I've been doing with the interns so far is coming up with a brief of what we're looking for within the hardware, and then showing them some inspiration and reference that we love using from my extensive book library. And within the 2-week period, they have to have designed a product by the end of it. So product design is hit. We do photo shoots, whether it's photographing an existing project that we are recording for our website, or as it was with our first, actually with Taylor, who is I'm her mentor, and she's part of the scholarship program. She came on a shoot we did for Vogue Living for a job I finished with Durback Block Jagger that's in the latest Australian-made Vogue Living, if you want to check it out. And she also came on a shoot for what we were doing for our own product as well. So she got really different experience with doing photo shoots as well. We do lots of, at the moment, we're looking for a new warehouse. So Ellie's been working on putting my bubble map into a floor plan of what my existing space can look like and what that flow is going to be, and how I'm going to fit everything I want into a space that's smaller than I would like. It can also be, interior design is not always just about that 10% of creative. There's a lot of admin in there. So we do some FF&E schedules. We also do spec sheets. And then I also show them the runnings of even unpacking a container. We've had 3 containers in last week. So it's literally, how do we get this stuff and place it somewhere before it goes to where it's going to be living? And that's a big part of the job too. Logistics of furniture, logistics of materials, and how to make that all work too, so you get seamless jobs. I don't know, there's so many more things. There's this enormous list. Oh, one of them was I have a textile and wallpaper range, and we've got a new one coming out. Becky was working on doing the whole colour palette for the whole range. So I gave her a brief, and then she had to come up with 10 colours that the whole range would then ended up being printed. And that actually goes to its first test print next week, amongst many other things. Sitting in on work in progress meetings has been a really interesting one as well, because within those work in progress meetings, that's where a lot of ideas and my whole team sit in those, and you get to have a say, come up with great ideas, and then each of the interns gets to work with one of my team members as well.
Wonderful, thank you. I'll also point out that Chloe's sitting on the floor.
Intern
so
next
round.
Yeah. I try and make it fun. When I was 16 and at school, I went for you go and do an intern for a week, and it was the most boring thing I've ever done in my life. So I have tried to make our intern program exciting, and you get to touch all parts of it, that you maybe walk out knowing how to not run a small business, but understand a small business, as well as also understanding that, in these courses, you might not end up working in an interior design firm, but there's all these other incredible things that you can do, from product design to textile design to working in retail to, there's so many stepping stones to your career that this is giving you this foundation to do many, many things. So I find that really exciting. So I try and make it as exciting as possible and inspiring as possible.
Any other questions from the floor? Well, thank you, Sibella. It was lovely to have you come in, and we look forward to seeing all of your adventures to come.
Thanks.